The good member from the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we in Washington gained statehood November 11th, 1889. And since November 11th, 1889, our state's constitution gave people the power to elect their sheriffs, their constitutional sheriffs, to protect them in each one of the separate counties. And today, so many years later, I would count them, Madam Speaker, but I'm so tired. We are now under this underlying bill, and as a subject of this amendment, which points this fact out, we are taking away the right of the people to select and elect their own county sheriff. And Madam Speaker, you know as well as I do that my district has different demographics than yours, and we may choose different sheriffs. We might choose different sheriffs with different viewpoints and different viewpoints on policing. But you know what I found in the 35th district? I have a Republican sheriff, I have an independent sheriff, and I have a Democrat sheriff. And I am so proud of each and every one of them. They all bust their butt, their deputies put their lives on the line, and they all do their job to the best of their possible ability. And the people in Kitsap and Mason and Thurston counties selected different sheriffs, but all three of them, regardless of what party they came from, all care about people. They all care about doing the job that they were elected to do. And what this intent section amendment points out is it unmasks the bill itself to point out its true intent, which is to strip away the democratic rights that have existed forever and ever in our country and in our state's constitution since November 11th, 1889. And here we are in the year 2026, stripping those democratic rights away. And we hear so often, threats to democracy, threats to democracy, threats to democracy. Well, Madam Speaker, this intent section amendment points out how this bill is a threat to our constitutional rights as citizens, it's a threat to our elected sheriffs, and it is a threat to democracy. Please vote yes.
Further remarks, the good member for the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. The underlying bill prohibits information sharing. It uses the term information. All this amendment seeks to do is clarify that phrase in the bill between public and non-public information, and that's important because our volunteers and cadets are oftentimes, especially in rural sheriff's offices and law enforcement agencies in our rural counties, helping with administrative and support role tasks. Sometimes it could be like a concealed weapons permit. I've had that happen before where volunteers help with those kind of administrative actions as well. They're already pretty well trained on what is public and non-public information, but without the clarifying amendment in the underlying bill, Madam Speaker, what it does is it criminalizes perfectly well in order routines of all of our law enforcement agencies across Washington state. And what I fear is that creates a liability trap for many of our law enforcement agencies where they can inadvertently break this confusing underlying law if it were passed and signed into law. And that would cost many of our under-resourced law enforcement agencies in rural counties across Washington state for things that they knew how to do right now, but now could be confused as a result of the underlying bill without this amendment. And they just simply can't afford those liability traps. This could be a lot of money, and as you've already seen, people go after public agencies, law enforcement agencies, and even state government for things like the Public Records Act and everything else. And they try to turn these things and weaponize them into basically getting paid as a result of the law. And so when we don't clarify the language like this amendment does, that liability trap could sink some of our rural, small, local law enforcement agencies just because we have volunteers and cadets who are trying to do something they know is routine right now and oftentimes help with. But now the underlying bill will make that confusing. I think that's why this amendment is essential to have that clarifying language. Please vote yes.
The Member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment, I think it's important to know that, as you've probably heard already tonight, that the sheriff is a constitutionally created office in the state of Washington under our state constitution, Article 11. It's different than a police chief, which is an appointed, executive official. And permission to read?
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what we're talking about here in the amendment is the ability to exempt, the Pacific County Sheriff or any sheriff that was previously elected. But I think it exposes one of the biggest constitutional flaws in the entire underlying bill, which is extremely important. The Supreme Court precedent has already ruled on this back in the 90s when an initiative was passed to try to instate term limits for constitutional office set forth in our state's constitution. It went on to say if the Constitution creates an office and sets qualifications or intentionally leaves them minimal, the legislature cannot add new qualifications by statute. That's exactly what this underlying bill does, Mr. Speaker. That case was called Gerberding versus Monroe in 1998, and the initiative was 573. It was later struck down, which is why we don't have term limits. Not for me, not for you, not for the governor, and not for a constitutionally elected sheriff. And when we're talking about, I find it funny, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about exempting an already elected sheriff prior to the effective date in the bill, in this amendment, but we should be exempting after the effective date too, because we cannot statutorily add new qualifications, whether it's 2 years or 5 years, and bar people and reduce the pool of candidates through statute and bypass our state's constitution. Without this amendment, I think this amendment honestly doesn't even go far enough, because the underlying bill should be just tossed out in court immediately for this constitutional violation, Mr. Speaker. But the least we should do is adopt this amendment and then continue to adopt all the other amendments. Thank you.
A good member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the amendment is about protecting lawful enforcement discretion against political punishment, essentially. And this session, as this bill has been making its way through the process, I've come to hear from many of my constituents who come to my office this session or through email or through testifying on this bill as it moves forward. And one of the underlying fears and the underlying beliefs of my constituents in the 35th District, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill is fundamentally about political punishment of sheriffs that the government does not like. And you've heard about the CJTC from the good member from the 7th and the 31st just now. And when we talk about an unelected board making decisions, that seems kind of cloudy. But to know the fact that the vast majority of that board is controlled by the governor, the same set of governors who've been in charge in the single party for 40 years. My constituents don't trust that that board, controlled by Democrat governors for 40 years, would be used fairly against a Republican sheriff or maybe an independent sheriff or maybe a Democrat sheriff that the executive branch doesn't like. So when my constituents ask me about this bill, they view it purely as political punishment, and that's exactly why this amendment is important, because the job is inherently political, although I've talked to sheriffs who wish it weren't, who wish they didn't have to put a party label after their name when they ran for the office, who just want to do good police work and protect their communities and serve their constituents. But you can probably appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that the constituents in my district and the constituents in your district maybe don't always see eye to eye. Maybe we don't have exactly the same values. Maybe we have different beliefs. And that's exactly why the people should elect in our county, whether it be Whatcom County or Mason County, the sheriff of our choice. And they should be free because they are a constitutional officer from the political punishment of this bill. Please vote yes on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this sunset amendment is important. I hope you join me in voting yes. It reminds me when we're talking about sunsetting a bill or a program or a policy that I wish there was more sunset provisions and more policies. It reminds me of the disastrous policies around police pursuit. What if those had been subject to a sunset? Maybe there didn't have to be 500,000 people to sign a petition to the legislature to end.
To the member, please direct your remarks to this amendment itself. Please proceed.
Sure thing, Mr. Speaker. I think the sunset is critically important. We've heard about dumpster fires, and we've heard about a lot of different things here on the floor just now about this amendment. And I just think that we should adopt this sunset amendment into the underlying bill because there's many policies in the legislature that if they had a sunset amendment applied to them before, like we're asking for in this amendment here, that we could have avoided coming back later in future legislative sessions to fix some of the mistakes. And I think that even if, Mr. Speaker, that this sunset amendment is not taken, there's another form of a sunset, and that's a court, which will throw this bill out because it's blatantly unconstitutional. Please vote yes.